When the factory closes and the paychecks stop and the savings drain down to almost nothing, a man starts to see his life differently. Not with clarity exactly. More like the way you see a road at dusk, everything familiar, but the light all wrong, the distance is hard to judge, the edges soft and unreliable. Garrett Calloway had been seeing his life that way for 6 months. He stood at the kitchen window of their one-bedroom apartment in Gary, Indiana, watching the neighbor's dog cross the parking lot alone. The dog moved with purpose, as if it knew exactly where it was going, and Garrett envied it in a way that would have embarrassed him to admit out loud. He was 53 years old. He had built custom cabinets and restored century-old farmhouses across 3 counties. He could read the grain of a piece of walnut the way other men read a newspaper, understanding what it had been and what it wanted to become. For 15 years, Callaway and Sons Construction had given him steady work and the kind of satisfaction that comes from making broken things whole again. Then the economy in their corner of Indiana did what economies sometimes do. It contracted quietly and without apology, taking the business with it along with half the small enterprises that had kept the surrounding towns breathing. 6 months of unemployment. 6 months of watching the number in his bank account move in one direction only. Behind him in the space that served as dining room and Cody's bedroom, both his son was doing homework at the card table Garrett had bought for $12 at a garage sale 3 blocks over. Cody was 8 years old, dark-haired like his mother had been, with the kind of concentrated expression when he worked that made him look older than his years. He never complained about the card table. He never complained about sharing the apartment's single bedroom with his father, sleeping in the twin bed against the wall while Garrett took the pull-out. He was in ways that sometimes made Garrett's chest ache with a particular wordless gratitude, a remarkably good kid. On the kitchen counter sat Cody's baseball glove. It was 2 years old now, the leather beginning to crack along the thumb seam, the webbing loose in the lower pocket. Garrett had bought it at full price from Decker's Sporting Goods when work was steady and the future felt like something a man could reasonably plan for. Now the glove sat there every morning when Garrett made coffee, a quiet inventory of everything he wanted to give his son and couldn't quite manage. He looked at it every day and made himself look, because he had decided early on that ignoring the evidence of your own failures was the first step toward repeating them. He heard the mail slot open and close. He almost didn't go. Bills mostly. Sometimes a circular for a grocery store 2 towns over. But something made him cross the kitchen and pick up the small pile from the floor, and the envelope on top stopped him immediately. It was cream-colored and heavy, the kind of stationery that cost real money. His name was typed across the front in a font that looked almost old-fashioned, deliberate, and precise. The return address was a law office in Indianapolis. Garrett stood in the hallway and read the letter twice. Then he sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and read it a third time. The letter was from an attorney named Clifford Moss, representing the estate of one Edmund Hargrove, deceased formerly of Millhaven, Indiana. It informed Garrett that he had been named the sole heir to a property located at 14 Hargrove Lane, Millhaven, a Victorian residence of approximately 4,000 square feet, situated on 5 acres, which had stood vacant for the past 30 years. The estate also included a modest account designated for property taxes sufficient to cover exactly 12 months of obligations. After that, the financial responsibility would transfer entirely to Garrett. There was a handwritten note attached on different paper in a script that was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who chose their words the way craftsmen choose their tools. It said, "Open only when the house speaks to you." Garrett had never heard of Edmund Hargrove. He did not know he had family in Millhaven. As far as he had ever been told, he had no family at all beyond Cody. He sat on the hallway floor for a long time, turning the note over in his hands, reading those 10 words again and again until they stopped being mysterious and started being something else, an instruction maybe. A beginning. Then Cody appeared in the kitchen doorway, still holding his pencil, and looked at his father sitting on the floor with an expression that contained no alarm, only curiosity. This was one of the things about Cody that Garrett loved most, the boy's capacity for accepting the world as it presented itself without immediate judgment. "Dad, "You okay?" Garrett looked at his son. He looked at the letter in his hand. He thought about the cracking glove on the kitchen counter and the dwindling bank account and the dog in the parking lot who knew exactly where it was going. "I think," Garrett said slowly, "that we might have a house." The drive to Millhaven took 2 hours through the flat, wide landscape of central Indiana, where the land seems to breathe slowly and the sky is always larger than you expect. October had turned the trees along the highway into something almost violent reds and oranges that looked like they were lit from inside, burning without heat. Cody pressed his face against the passenger window and watched the countryside move past with the particular absorption of a child experiencing something new, cataloging everything without knowing he was doing it. They talked about what they might find. Cody had theories, most of them involving secret passages and underground tunnels, which he had developed from a combination of the two mystery novels he'd read and a documentary about medieval castles that had been his obsession for the better part of the previous winter. Garrett let him talk. He liked listening to his son construct possibilities from nothing the way a good craftsman improvises when the material doesn't behave exactly as expected. There was something in the quality of Cody's imagination that reminded Garrett of the best kind of problem solving, not guessing exactly, but reasoning forward from what you knew toward what you didn't, trusting the logic to hold. He had done some research the night before. Edmund Hargrove was listed in Old County records as a manufacturer industrial components, mostly contracts with automotive suppliers throughout the Midwest. There were references to a business partnership with someone named Reginald Voss, going back to the early 1960s. After that, the record grew sparse. Property filings, tax records, and then in 1994, a missing persons report that was never resolved. Edmund Hargrove had simply stopped appearing in any document anywhere, and the house at 14 Hargrove Lane had sat empty ever since. 30 years of silence. Millhaven appeared around a long curve in the highway, a town of maybe 3,000 people arranged around a main street that had clearly seen better decades. There was a diner with red vinyl booths visible through plate glass, a hardware store with wooden floors you could see warping from the sidewalk, a pharmacy with a hand-lettered sign in the window, and alongside these signs of persistence, the quieter evidence of contraction, empty storefronts for lease signs gone gray with age, a building on the corner with boards across the windows, and weeds pushing up through the parking lot asphalt. It was the kind of town that had decided to keep existing and was doing so with a stubbornness that Garrett found in a way he couldn't have articulated precisely, deeply admirable. They stopped at a gas station to ask for directions to Hargrove Lane. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, with the kind of face that has spent considerable time outdoors and carries the evidence of it with dignity. She looked at Garrett for a moment before he finished introducing himself. "You're the one who inherited the Hargrove place," she said. It wasn't a question. "Word travels," Garrett said. "In Millhaven it does." She studied him with a frank attention that was not unkind. Edmund was a private man, kept mostly to himself the last years before he disappeared. People wondered what would happen to that house eventually. Some thought the county would take it. Others thought whoever owned the land would just let it fall down. She gave them directions. The last thing she said as they were leaving was this: "That house has good bones, always had good bones. It just needs someone who understands what that means." Garrett thought about that for the remaining quarter-mile down Hargrove Lane until the property appeared through the trees. He stopped the truck at the gate. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The house was enormous. 3 stories of Victorian architecture rising above 5 acres of overgrown grounds, the kind of structure that announces its own history simply by existing turrets and bay windows, and a wraparound porch held up by carved columns, a roof line complicated with dormers and decorative trim, a tower on the east side that rose above everything else and looked out over the surrounding countryside like a sentry that had been keeping watch for a very long time. 30 years of neglect had worked on it the way time works on everything. The paint was peeling in long, curling sheets. Several windows were boarded. The porch sagged at the center, and the grounds had been reclaimed by whatever grew fastest and most aggressively when left alone. But the bones. Garrett could see them the way he always could, through the surface damage and the years of deferred maintenance, the way a doctor reads through symptoms to the underlying structure. The foundation was local limestone quarried and laid in the manner of the previous century, nothing that was going to shift or crack under pressure. The timber framing visible through the gaps in the exterior was old-growth hardwood, the kind that doesn't exist commercially anymore, dense and slow-grown, and built to outlast everyone who would ever argue about it. The porch columns, though weathered, were intact to their bases. The tower, though its paint was entirely gone, showed no structural lean. The bones were exceptional. Dad, Cody said quietly beside him, "Is this really ours?" Garrett looked at his son's face and saw something there that he recognized, the particular light that comes on in a person when possibility presents itself after a long absence of it. He had not seen that light in Cody's face for some months. He had missed it more than he'd known. "If we can make it work," he said, "let's go see." The front door key had come with the inheritance papers attached by a small paper tag on which the attorney had written the address in the same careful script as the attached note. Garrett turned it in the lock and the door swung inward with the kind of groan that 30 years of disuse produces, deep and resonant, the sound of something enormous that has been holding its breath and is finally permitted to exhale. The entry hall stopped him. He had restored enough historic homes to know fine craftsmanship on site, and the entry hall of the Hargrove house was exceptional by any measure. A grand staircase swept upward from the center of the space, its banister carved from what appeared to be solid walnut. The newel post at the bottom, a complex piece of work. A carved column that incorporated botanical details Garrett couldn't quite identify, without getting closer, leaves and vines rendered with the specificity of someone who had studied the actual plants, rather than working from memory. The floors were wide plank hardwood buried under 30 years of dust, but showing honey-colored warmth beneath in the places where the light from the stained glass panels beside the front door reached them. Those panels were extraordinary deep blues and greens arranged in a pattern that seemed almost architectural, as if they were mapping something rather than simply decorating. The ceilings were 14 feet. The crown molding was intact. Cody had already moved past him into the parlor, drawn by something Garrett couldn't see from the doorway. He followed and found his son standing beneath a crystal chandelier, its hundreds of facets catching the October light that came through tall windows and breaking it into fragments across the dusty floor. The fireplace in the parlor was marble gray and gold veining, carved mantelpiece, the work of someone who was thinking about beauty as a permanent feature rather than an added expense. They moved through the house slowly, the way you move through a place that deserves to be taken seriously. The dining room retained its original mahogany table, enormous and still faintly gleaming under the dust, as if it had been waiting patiently for someone to come back and use it. The kitchen had its original built-in cabinetry, hutches and pantries, and a butler sink. All of it constructed with the kind of attention to detail that Garrett associated with craftsmen who understood that the work would outlast them. He opened cabinet doors and examined the joinery. Dovetailed corners, hand-cut, not machine. The drawer bottoms were fitted wood, not plywood. Every choice in this kitchen had been made by someone who was thinking about 50 years from now. Edmund Hargrove had built for permanence. Upstairs, they found 6 bedrooms each, with its own character and its own light. And it was the room in the tower that made Cody stop completely and look around with an expression that Garrett had never quite seen on his son's face before, something between wonder and recognition, as if this was a place he'd been trying to remember rather than encountering for the first time. The ceiling of the tower room was painted with a star map, the constellations rendered in silver and gold against deep blue. Technically accurate, and yet somehow more than accurate, lovingly done by someone who wanted the stars to be permanent, who understood that a child looking up at a painted sky might need it to be exactly right. "Can this be my room?" Cody asked. Garrett looked at his son standing in the middle of that painted sky, the dust motes moving around him in the afternoon light. "That's your room," he said. On the way back downstairs, they encountered Mrs. Eunice Whitmore at the fence line. She was 70 years old and carried herself with the erect posture of someone who has decided at some point that circumstances are not going to bend her. She held a covered dish that smelled even from the porch like something slow cooked and substantial, the kind of food that takes most of a day and fills a house with warmth while it's happening. "I live next door," she said, extending the dish through the gap in the fence. "I figured you'd be hungry after the drive and the tour." Garrett accepted the dish. He had the feeling looking at Mrs. Whitmore that she had been watching for them, not casually, but with the attention of someone who had been given a task and had been performing it faithfully. "You knew Edmund Hargrove," he said. It came out as a statement rather than a question. She regarded him steadily. 40 years worth of knowing, she said. He was a complicated man with a particular kind of integrity. She paused. He believed that certain things needed to be set right. He spent a great deal of his life working toward that. What kinds of things? She looked at the house for a moment, and in her expression, Garrett caught something he couldn't quite name. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The patient kind of sorrow that has been carried for a long time and has settled into the body like an old injury that no longer announces itself acutely, but is present in every movement, every posture, every morning. You'll find out, she said, in his own order on his own schedule. Edmund was particular about how things got revealed. She turned back to Garrett. Don't let anyone rush you, and don't let anyone tell you this house isn't yours. It is, more than you know yet. She returned to her own property with the same deliberate posture she'd arrived with, and Garrett stood on the porch, watching her go, the covered dish warm in his hands, with the feeling that something had already begun that he didn't yet have the vocabulary to describe. They spent the first 3 weeks establishing what Garrett mentally categorized as beachhead conditions, 2 livable bedrooms with the least structural damage, functional utilities brought up from minimal maintenance level to actual working order, the kitchen made serviceable enough for real cooking. Garrett took whatever carpentry work he could find in town, a kitchen renovation for the Bergman family on Chestnut Street, some window work at the Methodist Church, 3 days helping a farmer outside town build a new equipment shed. The money was thin, but it was moving, and motion, Garrett had learned over 53 years of living, was its own form of stability. A man who is working is a man who has not stopped. Cody adapted to the new school with the resilience that Garrett had come to recognize as his son's most reliable characteristic. He made a friend within the first week, a boy named Marcus from down the road, and he came home every afternoon with the specific kind of energy that comes from a day of genuine engagement rather than mere endurance. He was interested in everything, which was something Garrett had always attributed to Cody's nature, but which he now suspected had been partly suppressed by the apartment in Gary. The smallness of their circumstances, the sense that possibility was a thing that existed elsewhere. But it was the house itself that Cody engaged with most completely. He had appointed himself, without any formal declaration, the house's primary historian and investigator. He moved through the rooms, methodically examining everything, asking Mrs. Whitmore questions whenever she came by, which was often always with food, always with the patient manner of someone who had been waiting for particular questions to be asked and was prepared to answer them carefully when they arrived. He cleaned surfaces with a thoroughness that Garrett found genuinely impressive, in an 8-year-old working section by section, never rushing, never losing interest. Most children his age would have abandoned the project after a week. Cody treated it like a responsibility, which was why on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, 3 weeks after their arrival, it was Cody who found it. Garrett was in the dining room working on a window frame when his son's voice came from the parlor with a quality that made him set down his tools immediately. Not alarm, but a particular kind of focused intensity that he'd learned to pay attention to over 8 years of raising this particular child. When Cody sounded like that, something real was happening. "Dad, there's something in this wall." Garrett went to the parlor and found Cody at the far wall where he'd been working through the vintage wallpaper section by section with a soft cloth. In one area, the paper had separated from the plaster beneath, and behind it, barely visible in the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, was a recess. Not damage, not a crack. a deliberate recess carved into the wall with smooth, finished edges. Garrett ran his fingers along the perimeter and felt the craftsmanship immediately, the same quality he'd seen in the staircase banister, the cabinet joinery, the fireplace mantelpiece. This was Edmund's work, or someone Edmund had directed with great precision. The recess was approximately the size of two stacked fists, and inside it his fingers found something smooth and cold, and heavier than he expected. He extracted it carefully. The key was unlike anything he'd encountered in 15 years of restoration work. It was brass solid and substantial, heavier than it looked. The bow, the round top portion, was shaped into a heart, but a stylized one, almost architectural. In its precision, the curves too deliberate to be purely decorative. And covering every surface of the key from bow to blade was a dense pattern of engraved symbols, compass, roses, and interlocking circles, what appeared to be small architectural elements in a series of marks that Garrett couldn't immediately categorize, but that felt in their arrangement like a language rather than decoration. It was without question the work of an artist who was also an engineer. Cody's eyes were enormous. "It's like something from a real story," he said. Garrett turned the key in his palm and felt the weight of intention in it. Someone had made this with great care and greater purpose. This was not a key that had been hidden carelessly or quickly. Every element of its construction and concealment had been considered, probably over a period of years. "Let's see what it opens," he said. They spent the next hour trying every lock in the house. The key was too ornate for the simple door locks, too large for the cabinet latches, wrong in its geometry for the modern deadbolts that had been added at various points over the decades. But as they moved through the rooms, Garrett began noticing something that stopped him repeatedly. The symbols on the key were present throughout the house. The compass rose that dominated the key's bow was carved into the newel post at the base of the staircase. He had admired it the first day without understanding it. The interlocking circles from the key's shank appeared in the decorative medallion at the center of the dining room ceiling. The heart shape was echoed in the stained glass panels beside the front door, not as a central element, but as a repeated motif woven through the larger design present. If you were looking for it, and invisible if you weren't. The key wasn't meant to open a door. It was the first piece of a map. Garrett said this aloud, slowly, working it out as he spoke, and Cody listened with the complete attention he brought to problems he found genuinely interesting, which was a different kind of listening than most adults managed. "He's showing us something," Cody said. "Like a trail." Exactly like a trail. That evening, after Cody was in bed in his star-ceiling room, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the key under a work lamp and a notebook he'd bought at the drugstore on Main Street. He sketched each symbol carefully, then began annotating where he'd seen each one repeated in the house's architecture. The exercise was calming in the way that detailed work always was for him. It required the kind of focused attention that left no room for the ambient anxiety that had been his constant companion for the past 6 months. By midnight, he had a rudimentary inventory. By 1 in the morning, he had the beginning of a theory. The symbols formed a sequence, and the sequence, if he was reading the architecture correctly, pointed downward. He was still sitting with this thought when he heard the sound of a car on Hargrove Lane and saw headlights arc across the kitchen window. At 7 in the morning, a vehicle turning onto this road was unusual enough to be noticeable. By 7:15, a black sedan, expensive late model, with the particular restraint of something bought to convey authority rather than pleasure, had pulled up the gravel drive, and a man was walking to the front door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to arriving and being welcomed. Garrett met him on the porch. The man was in his mid-50s, silver at the temples, tailored suit in a shade of gray that managed to be both conservative and deliberate. He had a leather briefcase and a handshake that was firm to the point of calculation, the handshake of someone who has practiced it into a tool. "Prescott Voss," he said, "attorney at law. I represent certain interests regarding this property." Garrett did not invite him in. He left the door behind him and stood on the porch in the cool November morning, hands in the pockets of his canvas work jacket, and waited with the particular patience of a man who has learned that the person who speaks first in a silence usually reveals more than they intend to. Mr. Calloway Voss said, settling into what was apparently a prepared presentation. I want to be direct with you. This house is a money pit. The restoration costs alone will exceed anything recoverable from the property's market value. I represent clients who are interested in purchasing this land for development purposes. He opened his briefcase and produced documents. The proposed purchase price was just over $1.2 million, which was more money than Garrett had seen in his life. He looked at the figure. He thought about the cracking baseball glove. That's a significant offer, he said carefully. It's a fair offer. Voss kept his voice level professional. Mr. Calloway, I've been monitoring this property for years. I know its history intimately. Edmund Hargrove was... He paused, choosing words with visible deliberation. Edmund Hargrove was an eccentric man who made certain choices in the final years of his life that didn't necessarily serve the people around him. Leaving this house to someone who has no resources to maintain it is, in my view, one of those choices. Garrett looked at Prescott Voss carefully. Not the briefcase or the suit or the number on the document, but the man's face, specifically the space around his eyes, where what a person is actually thinking tends to locate itself if you know where to look and have patience enough to look slowly. What he saw there was not the professional neutrality Voss was projecting. What he saw was hunger. Old, practiced, patient hunger, the kind that has been going a long time and has learned to disguise itself as reason. What exactly is your connection to the Hargrove property? Garrett asked. Our firm has had dealings with the estate for many years. That's not what I asked. Something shifted in Voss's expression, almost imperceptible, the way a fault line is imperceptible until the moment it isn't. My family and Edmund Hargrove had a business relationship going back decades, Voss said. There are outstanding matters related to that relationship. This property is central to resolving them. Garrett nodded slowly as if this answered something, which it did, though not necessarily in the way Voss intended. I appreciate the offer, Garrett said, but I'm not in a position to make that decision right now. We've only been here 3 weeks. Voss maintained his professional composure with visible effort. Mr. Calloway, I want to be honest with you. 3 families have lived in this house in the 30 years since Hargrove disappeared. All 3 sold within 18 months. The property has a way of making itself untenable for people who don't have significant resources. I can make this transaction simple and beneficial for you. The last words sat in the November air between them with an edge to it that Garrett recognized. 3 families, Garrett said. 3 families. Garrett nodded again. He shook Voss's hand with the same evenness the attorney had projected and watched him return to the black sedan and back carefully out of the gravel drive. He watched until the car disappeared around the bend. Then he went inside to find Cody. His son was in the library, a room they hadn't spent much time in, floor-to-ceiling shelves still populated with Edmund's books, which ranged from architectural history to what appeared to be genealogical research to multiple volumes of Indiana County records going back to the previous century. Cody was standing by one of the lower shelves, pointing at something with the focused expression he got when he had found something he didn't quite understand but intended to. This book was loose, he said. When I pulled it out, there was a space behind it. The space was similar to the one behind the parlor wallpaper, deliberately made, edges finished. Inside was a single piece of folded parchment, yellowed with age, but careful about holding itself together as if it understood its own importance. Garrett unfolded it slowly. It was a floor plan of the house. Or rather, it was a floor plan and something more. The architectural elements of the actual structure were accurately rendered, but overlaid on them was a second set of notations in Edmund's careful script rooms, within rooms passages where there appeared to be only walls, a vertical sequence of markings that descended below the basement level and terminated in a chamber that the drawings labeled in letters small enough to require Garrett to lean close as the heart. The symbols from the key were scattered throughout the drawing, connected by dotted lines that formed a trail unmistakable and deliberate, like a path marked through dense wood by someone who knew the terrain and wanted someone else to be able to follow it without getting lost. At the bottom of the parchment, in the same spidery hand he'd seen on the note in the attorney's office, someone had written for the rightful heir when the time comes to claim what was lost. Garrett stood in the Hargrove Library holding the map and thinking about three families in 30 years, all of them gone within 18 months. He thought about a man who had built an elaborate system of hidden rooms and concealed passages in a Victorian house in Indiana, and then disappeared from all public record in 1994. He thought about a key that didn't open any lock in the house, but pointed instead to a map that pointed to something deeper. He thought about Prescott Voss's controlled professional face and the hungry thing behind his eyes. Then he thought about Cody's face in the tower room, looking up at the painted stars. He folded the parchment and put it in his inside jacket pocket against his chest. It was in the middle of these thoughts that Mrs. Whitmore appeared at the kitchen door with a container of vegetable soup and an expression that suggested she had been expecting him to knock on her door shortly and had decided to save him the trip. "He's been at this property for years," she said before Garrett could speak. "The man who came this morning, Prescott Voss, his father's son." She set the soup on the counter and looked at Garrett with the directness he had come to understand was simply her manner. Not severity, just honesty stripped of unnecessary packaging. Edmund and Reginald Voss were partners for nearly 15 years. It didn't end well, and what happened between them. She paused in the careful way of someone choosing the true version of a complicated story. What happened between them is the reason Edmund left the house the way he did, and the reason he left it to you specifically. What reason is that Mrs. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. She was 70 years old, and she had been keeping something for a long time, and Garrett could see that she was calibrating how much of it to release and in what order. Edmund had apparently been particular about this too. Edmund believed in taking the long view, she said finally. He was willing to wait decades for something to be right. He thought that justice was worth that kind of patience. That real justice, not the quick kind, not the angry kind, required the same care as anything else built to last. She picked up her empty container and moved toward the door. "The key you found," she said, pausing with her hand on the doorframe. "The map your boy found behind the books. Those aren't accidents, Mr. Calloway. Edmund left them for someone specific. He knew who was coming. He didn't know exactly when, but he knew who." Garrett looked at her. How could he have known? She smiled, then not warmly exactly, but with the particular expression of someone who has arrived at the end of a very long story and is watching someone else arrive at the beginning of the same one. Because Edmund Hargrove, she said, was a man who understood his own family better than most people understand anything, even the parts of his family that didn't know they were his. She left him standing in the kitchen with that and the soup going cold on the counter and the map folded against his chest, and the first real shape of the truth beginning to form in the back of his mind, like a structure emerging from fog, not yet visible in its entirety, but unmistakably there, solid and permanent, and waiting to be seen. He took the map upstairs to Edmund's library and spread it across the reading table under the desk lamp. He pulled out his notebook and the key and set them beside it. The three things that had come to him in sequence, the beginning of a grammar he was only starting to learn. He thought about the photographs he hadn't found yet. He went to the parlor fireplace and looked at the mantelpiece, the marble he'd admired since the first day, the carved details he'd examined with a craftsman's appreciation every time he passed through. He ran his hands along the underside of the mantel shelf, along the surround, along the legs, pressing every place where the stone met the wall or met itself. He pressed, he pushed, and on the fourth panel from the left, a section of the marble surround pivoted smoothly on a hidden hinge, revealing a shallow compartment behind. Inside was a leather-bound album, its cover embossed with the same heart symbol he'd been finding everywhere in the house. He carried it to the window seat and opened it. The first pages held formal portraits from the 1960s. A man with dark hair and kind eyes, distinguished with the kind of face that carries its experiences with dignity rather than weight. Sometimes alone, sometimes with a woman whose hair was the color of autumn leaves and whose smile was specific rather than general. The smile of a person who smiled when they meant it and not otherwise. They were photographed in gardens at dinner tables on what appeared to be a trip to the northeast coast, Maine, maybe from the light and the rocky shoreline in the background. The images of them together carried the unmistakable quality of a record kept by someone who understood he was documenting something irreplaceable. Edmund Hargrove, and someone he had loved completely. The photographs grew more serious as the album progressed. The woman appeared less frequently and with an expression that told a story of difficult navigation between competing obligations. A formal photograph showed her beside a man Garrett didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, prosperous-looking, with a smile that was wide and revealed nothing beneath it. The notation beneath this photograph in Edmund's careful hands said, Rosalind and Reginald. October 1969. The man standing beside Rosalind was Reginald Voss. Garrett turned pages slowly. Near the back of the album, the photographs changed in character. They were less formally composed, more like surveillance than portraiture images, taken from a distance through trees or across streets, with the quality of a record kept by someone who could not make direct contact but could not stop watching either. And the subject of these photographs was a child. A boy photographed across years, photographed at a distance across seasons, across what appeared to be multiple moves in multiple homes, always from far away, always with the particular quality of images made by someone who was documenting a life they were not permitted to be part of, who had accepted that limitation and worked within it rather than against it. Beneath the first photograph of the child, Edmund had written Rosalind's son, born September 1971. The future I must protect from a distance. Garrett's hands had gone very still. He looked at the date. He turned it over in his mind with the same care he gave to a difficult piece of wood, slowly from multiple angles, not rushing toward a conclusion before the evidence was complete. He had his birth certificate memorized in the way that people who have spent time uncertain of their origins tend to memorize such documents, every detail of it, including the date. September 14th, 1971. He sat in the window seat of Edmund Hargrove's parlor for a long time without moving. Outside, the November wind moved through the overgrown grounds, and the last of the autumn color was coming down from the trees in slow, deliberate spirals, each leaf making its own unhurried way to the ground. Then he went upstairs to his jacket, where he'd folded it over the chair in his room, and from the inside pocket, he took out the envelope the attorney had given him, along with the inheritance papers. The envelope Edmund had sealed, the one with the instruction, open only when the house speaks to you. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Edmund's handwriting, in 2 lines only. Follow the compass. Trust the boy. Garrett sat with those words for a long time. Then he looked up at the ceiling toward the floor above, where Cody was asleep under the painted stars, and understood with a certainty that arrived not as a thought, but as something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when you see the grain of a piece of wood and understand all at once what it has been and what it wants to become. That Edmund Hargrove had known his name, had known Cody existed, had been watching them both from a distance across years with the same patient, heartbroken attention he'd given to the photographs in the album. The house had spoken. Now Garrett needed to learn what it was saying. The compass was in a wooden box. Garrett found the box on the morning of the 4th week, following the dotted lines on Edmund's parchment map from the library through the kitchen and into the pantry, where the map indicated a section of the back wall that appeared at first and second and third glance to be exactly what it looked like. Plaster over lath, the same as every other interior wall in the house. He spent 20 minutes pressing and pushing and running his hands along every seam before he understood that it wasn't a panel that moved, but a specific section of the baseboard, a 6-inch length of painted trim that, when he applied pressure at both ends, simultaneously released a catch somewhere inside the wall and allowed a section of the pantry floor to lift. Not a wall panel, a trapdoor. The space below was not large, 4 feet of clearance, a packed dirt floor, a smell of cold earth and old wood, and something else underneath both of those, something mineral and ancient that reminded him of the limestone quarries he'd seen east of town. Garrett lowered himself through the opening and stood in the cramped space with his phone flashlight cutting through the dark, and found that the space extended a low passage, rough-hewn but deliberate, running toward the back of the house in the direction of the foundation wall. He went back upstairs. Cody was at the kitchen table eating cereal, still in the worn gray sweatshirt he slept in, his dark hair uncombed, reading one of the books he'd pulled from Edmund's library shelves. He was currently working through a volume on Indiana architectural history from the 1940s, with the focused attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him, which was most things. I found the next part, Garrett said. Cody looked up immediately. The book closed without being marked. The passage was narrow enough that they moved through it single file, Garrett first with the flashlight, Cody close behind. The walls were fieldstone, the same limestone that formed the house's foundation, and the construction was careful. This had not been dug hastily or improvisationally. This had been planned and built by someone who understood load-bearing principles in soil pressure and drainage and had taken the time to do the work correctly permanently. The floor was packed dirt hard as clay dry despite the season. Cody said nothing as they moved. He had the quality and moments of genuine interest of being entirely present without needing to announce it. He was paying attention the way good students pay attention, not performing engagement, but actually engaged storing everything. The passage opened into the house's basement, but a section of it they hadn't accessed before a room beyond the main basement chamber, separated from it by what appeared from the main basement side to be a solid foundation wall. In this hidden room, the construction changed entirely. The floor was flagstone, the ceiling was higher, and lining the walls were the empty wooden racks of what had once been a wine cellar stretching from floor to ceiling, on three sides, the wood old and dark and still solid. In the far wall, set into the limestone at approximately chest height, was a small alcove. And in the alcove was the box. It was mahogany, maybe 8 inches square with brass fittings and a small hasp that was not locked. Garrett lifted the lid and found the compass nested in a bed of green, felt a brass instrument antique and perfectly maintained its case engraved with the same symbols he'd been finding throughout the house. The needle swung when he tilted the box and then steadied. He held the compass level. The needle did not point north. It pointed to the foundation wall at the far end of the hidden room, steady and unwavering, with the conviction of something that has known where it was going for a very long time. "That's not north," Cody said. Garrett looked at his son. "No," he said. "It's not." He handed Cody the flashlight and approached the wall. He ran his hands across the limestone pressing testing, applying his carpenter's understanding of how things are assembled to the problem of how this thing might come apart. The stones were fitted together with a precision that spoke of craftsmanship. But craftsmanship, Garrett knew from long experience, always leaves evidence of its own logic. There is always a sequence. There is always a keystone that once found reveals the whole. He found it in the lower right quadrant of the wall, a stone that sat fractionally proud of its neighbors enough that his fingertips registered the difference before his eyes confirmed it. He pressed. He heard a sound from somewhere behind the wall, a mechanism engaging springs compressed over decades, releasing their long-held tension. And a section of the wall 4 stones wide, 5 stones tall, pivoted inward on a central axis to reveal a space beyond. The space beyond the pivot wall was a vault of sorts, not large, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The walls fitted with oak shelves that had been oiled against the moisture at some point and were still sound. On the shelves were several items, a leather portfolio tied with a cord, a smaller wooden box, and a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth and secured with a length of faded ribbon that had once been blue. Garrett reached for the letters first. He untied the oilcloth carefully. The letters inside were on paper that had yellowed but held together, written in a hand he didn't recognize, smaller and rounder than Edmund's script, with a quality of care in each form letter that suggested someone who had thought about penmanship as a form of respect for the reader. There were perhaps 30 letters in the bundle, and the first one began, "My dearest Edmund." Garrett stood in the hidden vault beneath the Hargrove house and read the first letter through completely. Then he read the second one. Then he sat down on the flagstone floor with his back against the pivot wall, and Cody sat beside him without being asked close enough that their shoulders touched, and Garrett read several of the letters aloud in the cold underground room while the compass sat on the shelf above them, its needle still pointing steadily at the space that now lay open. Rosalind had written the letters across a period of approximately 4 years, from 1969 to 1973. They were love letters, but they were also something more than that. They were the record of a person navigating an impossible situation with remarkable honesty, trying to be faithful to multiple things that had become mutually exclusive. She wrote about Reginald with the absence of contempt that is more damning than contempt, not hatred, just the precise documentation of a marriage that had been built on misrepresentation and had never corrected itself. She wrote about Edmund with a tenderness that was specific and earned the tenderness of someone who has been genuinely seen by another person and understands how rare that is and how much it matters. And she wrote about the child. In a letter dated March 1971, she wrote, "I have decided that whatever happens between us, whatever becomes of everything else, I will make certain the child is protected. Reginald must never have access to what is mine to give. I have spoken with an attorney in Indianapolis, not Reginald's attorney, a different one. Someone Edmund found for me, and there will be documents that Reginald cannot touch. The child will have what I can give him, even if I cannot give him the truth about his father." In a letter dated November 1972, she wrote Edmund, "I am frightened. Not of Reginald exactly. I am frightened of what he is capable of when he believes something belongs to him. He has that quality, the absolute conviction of entitlement, the certainty that what he wants is what he deserves. I have watched him dismantle a business partnership through that conviction alone, piece by piece, and call it justice. I do not want our son to grow up knowing the shape of that thinking. I do not want that to be the model he learns from." The last letter in the bundle was dated January 1973. Rosalind had written it quickly, the hand less careful than the others, the lines less even, as if she was writing in a condition of some urgency with less time than she needed. "Edmund," she wrote, "if something happens to me, you must not let Reginald have the trust. He will find a way to take it if he knows it exists. The documents are with the Indianapolis attorney. The account information is somewhere only you would think to look. I trust you to find it. I trust you to protect him. I have always trusted you more than I have trusted anything else in my life, and I am not a woman who trusts easily. Whatever happens, know that. Know that you were the realest thing." The date of the letter was January 8th, 1973. Garrett knew from the research he'd done in the days after receiving the inheritance letter that Rosalind had died in an automobile accident in February 1973. 1 month after this letter, he sat on the flagstone floor for a long time after reading the last letter. Cody sat beside him without speaking. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who are both thinking about something large and need the quiet to do it properly. Then Garrett reached for the leather portfolio. Inside the portfolio were financial documents, technical and dense, spanning several decades, but clear enough in their overall shape once you understood what you were looking at. Reginald Voss, in the period between 1970 and 1975, had executed a systematic dismantling of his partnership with Edmund Hargrove. The method was sophisticated shell companies established in other states, contracts redirected through intermediary firms, shared accounts drained through a sequence of transactions, each small enough to avoid triggering review, and the documentation of all of it, assembled over years with the patience of someone building an unassailable case, was here. Edmund had gathered everything, every transaction, every redirected contract, every fraudulent accounting entry. He had been doing this quietly, carefully for decades. The amount stolen from the Hargrove-Voss partnership across those years was, in the money of that time, substantial. Adjusted for what it would have grown to over the following decades, it was a different order of magnitude entirely. And there was a second set of documents in the portfolio that made Garrett's hands go very still. These were legal instruments prepared by an attorney, notarized, dated 1973. Rosalind's trust documents, establishing an account for the benefit of her son, designated by name, not by Reginald's surname, by Edmund's. The name on the trust documents was Hargrove. Garrett read the name twice. Then he looked at his son sitting beside him in the underground room. Cody's face illuminated by the phone flashlight, patient and attentive and entirely present. "I think," Garrett said slowly, "that I am not exactly who I thought I was." Cody considered this with the seriousness it deserved, the way he considered everything that seemed to matter. "Were you wrong about the important parts?" he asked. Garrett thought about that carefully. No, he said, I don't think so. He thought about his father, the man who had raised him quiet and hard-working and gone too early from a heart that wore itself out, doing too much for too little. The man had never spoken of Rosalind, except to say she had died when Garrett was very small. He had never spoken of Edmund Hargrove at all. Whether he had known the truth or whether the truth had been kept from him too was a question Garrett couldn't answer from the floor of a hidden basement room. But it was a question that had weight, and he felt it settle onto him as he gathered the documents carefully and retied the oilcloth around the letters. He put everything back in the vault for now, memorizing the contents and their arrangement. He would need to return with proper materials to photograph and preserve it all. He closed the pivot wall and listened to the mechanism engage with the same sound of deliberate finality it had made on its way open. He picked up the compass from the shelf where Cody had set it. The needle still pointed into the closed wall at whatever lay beyond the vault, in a direction that was neither north nor any other conventional bearing. There was more. Of course there was more. They were halfway back through the passage to the pantry when the problems began. The first one arrived on a Monday, a county building inspector who appeared at the front door at 8 in the morning without any prior notice, clipboard in hand, with the bureaucratic manner of someone performing a function they find genuinely satisfying. He cited 7 specific concerns with the property's electrical system, all of them framed as safety issues, several of them genuine, several of them reaching beyond what the applicable standards actually required for a structure of this age and construction type. He left a written notice requiring remediation within 30 days, an estimated cost that Garrett calculated sitting at the kitchen table after the man left at just under $3,000. $3,000 he did not have. The second problem arrived 3 days later in the form of a letter from the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. A complaint had been filed by an unnamed party suggesting potential soil contamination on the Hargrove property, possibly related to historical industrial use. An inspection and soil testing would be required. Estimated cost to the property owner between $1,500 and $2,000. Garrett read this letter twice, folded it precisely along its original creases, and put it with the building inspector's notice in a folder on the kitchen counter. The third problem arrived at the end of the same week, a representative of the Millhaven Historical Preservation Society, a trim woman in her 50s who arrived with a gentle manner and a thick packet of documentation suggesting that the Hargrove property met the criteria for a restrictive preservation designation that would, among other things, require approval from the Society's board for any renovation work exceeding cosmetic repair. The process for obtaining such approval was detailed in the packet. It took an average of 4 to 6 months per application and required in most cases the services of an attorney familiar with preservation law. Garrett sat across from the woman at the kitchen table and listened to all of it with the controlled stillness he'd developed over decades of working with difficult materials, the stillness of someone who understands that reacting to a problem is different from addressing it, and that the two responses produce entirely different outcomes. After she left, he sat at the table alone and did the mathematics. The building inspection remediation, the environmental testing, the Preservation Society process. 3 things in 10 days, each one individually manageable. If he had money, none of them individually catastrophic, but together forming a wall that was designed to be exactly the height of his resources. Not taller, not shorter, exactly the height of what he had, as if someone had taken careful measure of him before building it. He thought about Prescott Voss's voice on the porch that first morning. 3 families tried before you. Mrs. Whitmore came by that evening. She didn't knock. She had developed a manner of appearing at the back door with food and information in proportions that Garrett had come to rely on, though he hadn't told her so directly. She took one look at the folder on the counter and sat down at the table without being asked. He's done this before, she said, when Garrett had walked her through the sequence of the past 10 days. To the Hendersons in 2003, to the Marcellus family in 2009, and to the Braddocks, who were the last ones in 2016. Each time it was a different combination of problems. Electrical, environmental, preservation, zoning. He mixes them up so it doesn't look like a pattern to anyone who isn't watching from the outside. Garrett looked at her. How do you know all this? Because Edmund asked me to watch, she said simply. He knew Prescott Voss would never stop searching. He knew that every family who came to this house before the right one arrived would go through exactly this. He asked me to keep records of everything Voss did. She paused. I have records going back 20 years, documented, dated, witnessed where possible. He's been doing this for 20 years, longer than that. But the documented cases go back to 2003. Garrett thought about the folder on the counter, the 3 letters in 10 days. He thought about the patience required to run that kind of campaign across 2 decades, the particular kind of patience that comes from certainty of eventual success from a man who has never been made to stop. Then the phone rang. It was the contractor in Evansville who had been his one reliable source of work since they'd arrived at kitchen renovation, 2 weeks of steady pay. The man's voice was apologetic and uncomfortable in the way of someone delivering news they'd been pressured into delivering. There had been a complaint filed against Garrett's contractor's license, a licensing question that would need to be resolved. He was going to need to put the project on hold. He was sorry. He hoped Garrett understood. Garrett thanked him and ended the call and put the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment without touching it further. He was out of work again. He had 3 administrative actions requiring money he didn't have. He had a house that was simultaneously the most valuable thing he'd ever owned and currently the source of every pressure being applied to his life. And he had a man with 50 years of family money and 20 years of documented practice at exactly this kind of campaign who was sitting somewhere comfortable waiting for a phone call. Garrett knew the phone number. It was on Voss's card, which was on the kitchen counter beside the folder. He sat at the table for a long time. Cody was upstairs doing homework. Mrs. Whitmore had gone home. The house was quiet around him in the way that large old houses are quiet, not empty exactly, but patient. The way things that have been standing for 100 years are patient with the shorter urgencies of the people inside them, understanding without judgment that human crises are temporary and foundations are not. He was still sitting there when he heard Cody's footsteps on the stairs. His son appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas holding the brass compass. He had taken to carrying it in the evenings, turning it in his hands, the way Garrett turned problems in his mind, examining it from different angles, looking for the angle that showed something new. The needle, as always, when he tilted it level, swung and pointed in that same inexorable direction. Dad, Cody said, "You look like you're thinking about giving up." Garrett looked at his son. "I'm thinking about a lot of things." Cody crossed the kitchen and set the compass on the table between them. The needle swung and steadied, pointing towards something that lay beneath and beyond the parts of the house they had already found. "Great Uncle Edmund gave this to us," Cody said. "Not to him." Garrett looked at the compass for a long time. He looked at his son's face, which held no uncertainty on this point whatsoever, the absolute clarity of a child who has thought something through and arrived at a conclusion that seems to him entirely obvious and wonders why it needs to be said at all. Then he pushed Voss's card to the far side of the counter and went to bed. In the morning, he called Clifford Moss, the attorney in Indianapolis, who had delivered the inheritance papers, and asked about the building inspection requirements. Moss was helpful and more knowledgeable than his dry manner suggested. He walked Garrett through the specific applicable standards, identified 2 of the 7 cited items as not applicable to structures of this age and construction type under Indiana code, and suggested that a formal written response disputing those items would likely reduce the financial requirement significantly. It would not eliminate it, but it would reduce it to something Garrett could address over time if he was careful. He began working through the problems one at a time, the way he worked through a complicated restoration methodically, without rushing, without allowing the scale of the whole to prevent progress on the parts. He wrote a formal response to the building inspector, citing the specific code provisions Moss had identified. He contacted a licensed environmental assessor who, after reviewing the complaint, identified it as a boilerplate filing with no site-specific basis whatsoever, and offered to provide a preliminary report for $400 rather than the $2,000 the IDEM letter had implied. He attended a meeting of the Historical Preservation Society and discovered that the restrictive designation process while genuinely slow, could be navigated without legal representation if you were willing to do the paperwork yourself and had the patience to attend the required meetings. He had patience. It was perhaps his most durable characteristic. And while he worked through the administrative wall Prescott Voss had constructed, he and Cody continued to follow Edmund's trail. Mrs. Whitmore came to them on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the folder had started accumulating, and she brought with her something she had been carrying for 30 years. She set it on the kitchen table beside the compass, a locket on a fine gold chain oval, with a small engraved design on the cover that Garrett recognized immediately as the same heart motif from the brass key and the stained glass panels and the album cover. Edmund gave this to me in 1994, she said, the week before he disappeared. He told me to keep it safe until the right person came to the house and that I would know the right person because they would already have found the key. She looked at Garrett with the steady gaze he had come to understand was her version of warmth. He told me something else, she said. He said the person I was waiting for might be tempted to give up when the pressure became significant. He asked me to give them this before that happened, if I could manage it. Garrett looked at the locket. He said, "It's a little late for before." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth curved fractionally. He said that too, she said. He said the timing would probably be imperfect. He said patience was required of everyone in this plan, including the person receiving it. Garrett opened the locket. Inside, on a tiny scroll of paper rolled to fit the space precisely, was a hand-drawn map, not of the house's visible rooms, but of something beneath them, below the hidden wine cellar, below the level of the foundation vault. A chamber, and at the center of the chamber, a symbol Garrett recognized without difficulty, the interlocking circles from the compass, from the key, from the ceiling medallion in the dining room. Beneath the symbol, Edmund had written two words, the heart. Below the map, in letters small enough to require the flashlight from his phone to read clearly, the sequence requires two. Garrett looked up at Cody. Cody nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, something he'd been turning over quietly for days and had nearly worked out on his own. Finding the way down to the chamber took 4 days. Edmund had not made it easy, and Garrett came to understand that the difficulty was intentional, not cruelty, but designed with a specific purpose. The path to the heart required a knowledge of the house that could only be assembled gradually by someone who had spent real time in every room, who had learned the logic of how Edmund thought, who had followed the trail in sequence rather than looking for shortcuts. You couldn't find the chamber without first finding the compass. You couldn't interpret the compass without the map from the library. You couldn't read the map without understanding the locket. And none of it made sense without the album, the letters, the portfolio, the whole story, in order the way Edmund had intended it to be learned. Edmund had required his heir to know the story before arriving at its conclusion. He had understood that arriving at the end without understanding the beginning was not arriving at all, it was just stumbling. The entrance to the chamber was in the tower room, Cody's room, which felt, in retrospect, exactly right. The room Edmund had painted with stars for a child he had never met, but had been watching from a distance for years. Behind the tapestry on the curved wall, when they had removed it carefully and examined the stonework behind it, they found the sequence Edmund had laid in specific stones pressed in a specific order that could only be determined by someone who had studied the symbols throughout the house, that released the catch on a section of the wall that swung inward on hinges so well fitted and so carefully maintained that it moved without a sound. Behind it, a staircase carved directly from the limestone bedrock, spiraling downward in a tight coil. The walls on both sides fitted with small alcoves for oil lamps that had never been updated to any modern equivalent. Edmund had left it exactly as it was built in the year the house was constructed, and the chamber was first carved. They went down slowly, Garrett first, Cody's hand on his shoulder. The air changed as they descended, cooler, drier, with the particular stillness of spaces that have been sealed from the weather for a very long time and have found their own equilibrium. The staircase ended at a heavy door, iron-banded oak, fitted with a lock of a complexity that stopped Garrett for a moment before he understood. He took the brass key from his jacket pocket. The ornate key with the heart-shaped bow and the symbols along its shaft, the key that didn't open any door in the house. It fit the lock with the certainty of something made for exactly this purpose, and nothing else the certainty of a thing that has found what it was always for. The door opened into darkness that the phone flashlight resolved into a circular chamber, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, the walls and floor and ceiling all carved from the same limestone bedrock. The chamber was cool and dry and absolutely silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if the silence itself had been designed. At its center on a stone pedestal stood a chess piece, a knight carved from white marble mounted on a mechanism that Garrett understood immediately was not decorative. The pedestal had moving elements. There were inlaid panels around its base, each carrying a symbol from the language Edmund had been teaching them since the first day. And in the walls of the chamber at four equidistant points were four recessed panels, each with a handhold, each clearly designed to be pulled or pushed in coordination with something else. The sequence requires two. Garrett studied the chamber carefully. He studied the pedestal and the mechanism. He thought about Edmund, a man who had built all of this with the intention that it would be found by a father and his son, and who had designed the final problem so that neither could solve it alone, because that was the point. That had always been the point. He explained to Cody what he thought the mechanism required. Cody listened with the complete attention he brought to things that mattered, asking two questions that were both precise and useful, and then they took their positions. It took them an hour and 40 minutes. The combinations were based on dates and coordinates they had assembled across weeks of following Edmund's trail, dates from Rosalind's letters, coordinates from the parchment map, numbers from the financial documents in the portfolio. Each wrong combination reset the mechanism with a soft internal sound that was neither punishing nor encouraging. Just patient, the sound of a thing that has been waiting this long and can wait a little longer. They worked through the possibilities methodically. Garrett calling the elements, Cody moving to the required panel, the two of them developing a rhythm that was Garrett noticed in the portion of his attention that wasn't absorbed by the problem, the rhythm of people who know each other's movements, who have spent enough time together that they can anticipate without thinking. The correct combination produced a sound that was nothing like the reset sound. It was deeper and more resonant, a series of mechanical engagements somewhere beneath the chamber floor, a sequence of releases following each other in a cascade, and then a rising, slow and steady, and entirely deliberate of a section of the floor itself. The vault that rose from the chamber floor was not what Garrett had expected, though he couldn't have said exactly what he had expected. It was a steel enclosure the size of a large trunk, its interior fitted with climate-controlled cases. He could hear the faint hum of a battery system that Edmund must have installed and maintained before his disappearance, running on some combination of solar and battery that he had designed to outlast him. Inside the cases were documents, photographs, audio recordings on cassette tapes with a small player to read them, and physical artifacts whose significance he was only beginning to understand. And in fireproof filing cabinets at the sides of the vault, organized with the precision of someone who had spent decades on this project and understood that chaos is the enemy of justice, the complete record. Everything Edmund had gathered, everything Reginald Voss had done, documented from beginning to end. The stolen contracts, the redirected accounts, the fraudulent instruments, the sworn statements of business partners who had lost everything and had never understood exactly how, and more records of Prescott Voss's own campaign extending across 2 decades, documented with the same patient thoroughness. Every harassed family, every manufactured inspection, every pressured contractor, every manipulated court order. Edmund had not just preserved evidence of the past, he had been watching the present. Garrett was standing in front of the open filing cabinet, beginning to understand the full scope of what he was holding when he heard the sound from above, footsteps in the staircase, more than one set moving with the particular confidence of people who do not expect to be stopped. He looked at Cody. Cody was already looking at the wall of the chamber where Edmund had installed in a small alcove that Garrett had not yet examined a communications device, old solid state, the kind of thing built in the late 1980s to be durable rather than elegant, built to last through decades of disuse and still function when needed. Beside it, on a small laminated card that had been sealed against moisture, were instructions in Edmund's handwriting, and above the instructions, a single sentence: in case of emergency, press and hold for 5 seconds. Cody looked at his father. Garrett nodded. Cody pressed the button and held it, counting under his breath. And somewhere above them, in the house and beyond it in the town, and beyond the town, things that Edmund Hargrove had arranged 30 years ago began to move. The footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase. The door that the brass key had opened swung inward. Prescott Voss stepped into the chamber with two men behind him who were not attorneys and looked at Garrett across the open vault with the expression of someone who has arrived after a very long time at the place he has always believed was his. The chamber was 20 feet across, and the three of them filled the doorway completely, which meant there was nowhere for Garrett to go except where he was standing in front of the open vault with Cody beside him and 30 years of Edmund Hargrove's careful work at his back. Prescott Voss looked different down here. The controlled manner that he'd worn on the porch, like a well-fitted coat, was still present, but thinned the way a fog thins when the wind picks up so you can see through it to the landscape underneath. What was underneath was something Garrett recognized from the photographs in Edmund's files. The same quality he'd seen in the old images of Reginald Voss, the absolute certainty of a man who has decided that what he wants and what he deserves are the same thing, and has organized his entire life around that conviction. The two men behind him were not attorneys. Garrett had understood this the moment they appeared in the doorway. They had the particular stillness of men who are paid to solve problems physically, and one of them had his hand inside his jacket in a way that was not ambiguous about its meaning. Garrett stepped slightly to his left, putting himself between Cody and the doorway. Voss looked around the chamber with the expression of someone who has been searching for a room for 20 years and is now standing in it for the first time. His eyes moved across the walls, the pedestal, the open vault, and came to rest on Garrett with something that was almost satisfaction. "I thought you might find your way down here eventually," Voss said. "You're more persistent than the others." Garrett said nothing. He was measuring distances and thinking about the communications device on the wall, whether Cody had held the button long enough, whether Edmund's 30-year-old system had done what it was built to do, and how much time he needed to create for it to matter. 3 families, Garrett said. "That's what you told me. On the porch that first morning." Voss moved into the chamber, his associates remaining near the door. He approached the vault with a deliberate slowness, the walk of a man who is finally unhurried because he believes the outcome is already determined. 3 families, he confirmed. The Hendersons were the easiest. They had a child with medical expenses and no savings. 2 months of inspection notices, and they called me. He examined the filing cabinets without touching them, the way a person examines something they believe is already theirs. The Marcellus family held out longer. 8 months. The Braddocks were stubborn nearly 14 months before they broke. He looked at Garrett. "You've lasted longer than any of them. I'll give Edmund that much." He picked better this time. The last sentence landed with a particular quality, and Garrett held it in his mind while he answered. "You knew Edmund chose me specifically." Voss looked at him with something that might, in different circumstances, have been respect. "I've known about you for years, Mr. Calloway. Edmund wasn't subtle about his surveillance once you knew what to look for. I knew he had identified an heir. I knew roughly when you might arrive. I simply didn't know how far you'd get before sufficient pressure could be applied." He moved toward the vault and reached for the nearest filing cabinet. Garrett said, "Don't." It came out with a quietness that was more authoritative than volume would have been. Voss stopped. The man near the door shifted his weight forward. "Those documents," Garrett said, "are evidence in a federal investigation. Touching them would add to what you're already facing." Voss looked at him steadily. "There is no federal investigation, Mr. Calloway." "There will be," Garrett said. Inapproximately, he glanced at Cody, who was watching the doorway with the focused calm of a child who has decided to be brave and is holding to that decision 15 minutes, maybe 20. Something moved in Voss's expression. Not fear, not yet, but the first intimation of a calculation going wrong, the very beginning of doubt in a man who has not doubted in a long time. He looked at the communications device on the wall, at Cody standing near it, at the small laminated card with its single sentence above the instructions. Garrett watched the man's face and understood that Voss had known about the chamber, but not about the device. Edmund had kept one thing entirely hidden from 3 decades of surveillance. One thing Voss had not been able to find. You activated it, Voss said. Cody did, Garrett said. Voss looked at Cody for the first time, really looked at him the way a person looks at something that has materially altered the situation. Cody looked back without flinching, with the steady, uncalculating attention of a child who is not afraid enough of the wrong things. Voss turned back to Garrett. He had pulled himself back together, but something had shifted in the architecture of his expression. The certainty was thinning at its edges, being replaced by something he clearly didn't know how to carry. Listen to me, Voss said. Whatever Edmund put in those files, whatever version of events he documented, you need to understand that you're only getting one side of it. My father built something. He built it from nothing over 30 years through hard work and legitimate enterprise. Edmund Hargrove was his partner, and Edmund Hargrove systematically undermined that partnership for personal gain. What my father did to protect himself was, it was theft, Garrett said. It was recovery. Voss's voice remained controlled, but the control required visible effort now. My father was protecting assets that were being stolen from him. The documentation in those files is Edmund's interpretation of events, not the truth. Garrett reached into the vault and took out the cassette player and one of the tapes. The tapes were labeled in Edmund's handwriting, dates and brief descriptions. He found the one he was looking for. It was dated October 1994 and labeled simply RV Final Meeting. He put the tape in the player. He pressed play. The audio quality was what you would expect from a recording made in 1994 on equipment that prioritized durability over fidelity. A slight hiss underneath everything, the acoustics of a room rather than a studio. The particular sound of two men talking in a space that neither of them knew was recording them. But the voices were clear. Two men, both of them speaking with the directness that comes when a conversation has moved past pretense into something more fundamental, when the social arrangements have been set aside and what remains is simply what is true. The first voice was Edmund's, older than Garrett had imagined it, with a precision in every sentence that matched the handwriting, the map, the hidden vault. A man who said exactly what he meant and exactly as much as he meant. The second voice was Reginald Voss, and Reginald Voss in October 1994 was not maintaining any professional manner whatsoever. He was speaking with the bluntness of a man who believes he is beyond accountability, who has spent enough years operating without consequence that candor in private has become for him indistinguishable from safety. He described in the particular terminology of a man who finds his own cleverness genuinely pleasurable to discuss exactly what he had done. The shell companies, the redirected contracts, the fraudulent accounting instruments, the forged elements of Rosalind's estate documents, the suppressed trust, the altered records, the decades of a child growing up without the inheritance his mother had tried to leave him. He used specific numbers. He named specific accounts. He explained the method with the satisfaction of a craftsman discussing his finest work. And then he said in a tone that shifted from satisfied to something colder, "You have nothing, Edmund. You've been chasing paper for 20 years, and you have nothing that any court will take seriously because I've made sure of it. Every record that matters is in my control. Every person who knows anything useful has been compensated for their silence, or has found that silence is simply their better option. You're done." Edmund's voice in response was measured and quiet and absolutely steady. "I know," Edmund said. "That's exactly what I needed you to believe." The tape continued for another 6 minutes. Garrett let it play. He watched Prescott Voss's face as his father's voice filled the limestone chamber and explained in his father's own words, and with his father's own evident pride, the crimes on which Prescott Voss had built his entire life. Voss sat down on the stone floor. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply what happened when the structure beneath a person gives way and there is nowhere else to go. He sat on the cold flagstone of the chamber his father had spent 30 years trying to find and reach, and he listened to his father's voice without moving. The tape ended. The chamber was very quiet. "My father told me," Voss said finally, "that Edmund Hargrove was the criminal. He said it from my earliest memory. He said Edmund had stolen from him, had taken everything they built together and hidden it, and that recovering it was a matter of justice. He said his voice was not steady. He said that what he did to protect the family was what any man would do. Garrett looked at Prescott Voss sitting on the floor and thought about the weight of a lie that size, the weight of building a life on a foundation you didn't know was false, of becoming the instrument of a wrong you'd been told was a right. He thought about Edmund, who had spent 30 years preparing for this moment and had understood in preparing for it that the son would be here as well as the father's crimes. He thought about what Edmund had written in his journal, which Garrett had found and read in the upstairs study during those long evenings of following the trail. I do not ask you to seek revenge. I ask only that you protect what is yours from those who would take it through similar means. Your father was wrong, Garrett said. Not about every part of himself, I don't know enough about him to say that, but about this, about Edmund, about Rosalind, about what belonged to whom. Voss looked up at him. The expression on his face was one Garrett had not expected to see there. Not defiance, not the last stand calculation of a man still looking for an angle, but something rawer and more difficult. The expression of a man looking at a version of his own life that he has never been permitted to see before, and finding that it does not resemble what he expected in any meaningful way. I've spent 20 years, Voss said quietly. 20 years of this. Following families into this house, applying pressure, waiting for them to leave. He looked at the vault, at the files, at everything Edmund had assembled. If he had all of this, why didn't he use it? Why didn't he go to the authorities in 1994 and simply end it? Because you would have destroyed the evidence, Garrett said. You or your father. You had enough reach in enough places that any direct approach would have given you time to respond and eliminate what you needed to eliminate. Edmund knew that. So he built something you couldn't reach, and he waited for someone who would find it at the right moment in the right way. Voss was silent. Then from above, from the staircase, from the upper passages of the house, came the sound of movement. Multiple people moving with the organized efficiency of people who know exactly where they are going and have been waiting for the signal to go there. The sound filled the staircase and the passage beyond the door, and then the doorway itself was occupied by a different kind of presence than the two men who had come in with Voss. Agent Carolyn Briggs was in her late 40s with the kind of face that has spent a career learning to register nothing prematurely. She wore a jacket with federal identification visible at the chest, and she moved into the chamber with the ease of someone entering a space she has been briefed on and has been thinking about for a long time. Behind her came 4 additional agents, and in the doorway at the back of the group, Mrs. Eunice Whitmore, who had apparently accompanied the federal agents from the surface, with the calm authority of someone who knows the house better than anyone else present and wanted to be here for this. Briggs took in the chamber, the vault, Prescott Voss sitting on the floor, and Garrett standing in front of the filing cabinets in one comprehensive look. Mr. Calloway, she said, are you and your son uninjured? We're fine, Garrett said. Briggs looked at Cody. You activated the signal, she asked. Cody said, yes, ma'am. The card said 5 seconds. Briggs nodded with the particular nod of someone filing away a detail that has confirmed something. Good instincts, she said, and moved on to the next task without dwelling on it. She turned to her agents. The 2 men near the door, Voss's associates, had made no movement toward resistance when the federal agents appeared, which was the most useful thing they had done since arriving. They were separated from each other and from Voss with professional efficiency and the particular quiet that comes when everyone present understands the situation and has accepted it. Prescott Voss stood when Briggs approached him. He did not require assistance. He stood with a remnant of the composure that had characterized him on the porch that first morning, but it was a different thing now. Not a performance, but something more like dignity. The dignity available to a man who has run out of alternatives and is choosing at the very end to meet the situation on his feet. Briggs read him his rights in the standard language. Voss listened. When she finished, he said, only I'll need to contact my attorney. You'll have that opportunity, Briggs said. She looked at Garrett. I need to brief you on several things. He stays, Garrett said when Briggs glanced at Cody. Briggs considered this briefly and accepted it. She gestured to one of her agents to begin the process of documenting the vault's contents, then turned back to Garrett with the directness of someone who has a great deal to communicate and prefers efficiency. The signal your son activated went to two locations, she said. Mrs. Whitmore's residence and our field office in Indianapolis. Edmund Hargrove established the connection to our office in 1993, the year before he disappeared. He made contact with an agent who has since retired, explained the situation in detail, provided preliminary documentation, and arranged for the signal to be routed to whatever active investigation the office was maintaining into the Voss family at the time of its activation. Garrett looked at her. He arranged it in 1993. He was thorough, Briggs said, with a particular appreciation of a federal agent for someone who did something properly. By the time he disappeared in 1994, he had already deposited copies of the core documents with our office under seal pending activation. We've been maintaining an open file on the Voss family's activities for 19 years. What you found in this vault tonight completes it. Garrett thought about Edmund in 1993, the year before he vanished from every public record building, the vault establishing the federal connection, installing the communications device, preparing everything for a future he would not be present for in any conventional sense. The patience of it, the absolute faith that the right person would eventually come, would follow the trail in the right order, would arrive in this chamber at the right moment with the right companion. What happens now, Garrett asked. Briggs looked at the filing cabinets at the cassette player still sitting on top of the vault. Prescott Voss will face federal charges, she said. Racketeering, conspiracy, financial fraud related to his own activities over the past 20 years, which we have documented independently of what's in this vault. The recordings and documents here will add historical fraud charges related to his father's crimes. Those can be prosecuted in the sense that the assets can be recovered and returned to the victims and their heirs. We're also looking at obstruction and harassment charges related to the three families he pressured out of this property. She paused. It will take time. Federal cases always take time, but the outcome is not in serious doubt. What about the assets, Garrett asked, the ones Reginald Voss stole from Edmund? Briggs looked at him steadily. That is a more complicated question, she said, and it's one for attorneys rather than federal agents. But I can tell you that the trust documents in this vault, Rosalind's trust established in 1973, are valid legal instruments. They were never legally dissolved. They were suppressed, which is a different thing entirely. An estate attorney will be able to speak to what that means for the current beneficiary. She said it without particular emphasis, but Garrett heard it clearly. The current beneficiary. Mrs. Whitmore had made her way through the agents to stand beside Garrett, and she put her hand on his arm briefly, not dramatically, just the touch of someone who has been waiting for this moment for a very long time and wants to mark it in some quiet way. He knew, she said quietly. Edmund knew this was how it would end. He just didn't know when. Garrett looked around the chamber at the vault Edmund had built, at the walls Edmund had carved at the staircase, Edmund had cut from the bedrock, so that one day a father and his son could come down it together and find what had been waiting for them. He thought about a man who had loved a woman and lost her, had been robbed by someone he trusted, had spent the remainder of his life building something that he would never see completed, sustained by faith in a future he could plan for, but not live to see. There was one more thing Garrett needed to find. He had known it since reading Rosalind's letters in the hidden wine cellar, since understanding the full shape of what Edmund had constructed here. The letters had been the record of a relationship. The financial documents had been the evidence of the crime. But Edmund would not have ended it there. The man who had built this trail piece by piece, who had required his heir to know the whole story before arriving at its conclusion, would have left something personal at the center of it. Not for the federal agents, not for the estate attorneys, for him. He looked at the vault carefully. He had been through the filing cabinets, the document cases, the audio recordings. But in the right rear corner of the vault, fitted into a space he had noted but not yet examined, was a small box, not metal, not a file. A wooden box, maybe 8 inches square, fitted with a small brass hasp. The wood itself a dark walnut that had been worked with the same craftsmanship as everything else Edmund had made across his life. Garrett reached in and took it out. He opened the hasp. Inside, nested in green velvet that had kept its color across 30 years of sealed darkness, was a ring. A woman's ring, white gold, a modest diamond, the kind of piece that was bought by someone who cared more about what it represented than what it announced. Beside the ring, folded small and then folded again, and then once more, was a letter. The letter was addressed in Edmund's handwriting to Garrett Calloway. Not to the heir, not to the rightful claimant, to Garrett Calloway by name in the careful, deliberate script that Garrett had come to know as well as he knew his own hands. He unfolded it slowly. The chamber had gone quiet around him. Briggs had understood something from the way he moved to the box, and she had stepped back and redirected her agent's attention to the documentation of the vault's contents. Mrs. Whitmore had moved to stand with Cody near the communications device. The space around Garrett was for the moment his own. He read the letter. Edmund had written it in 2 sessions. Garrett could see where the handwriting changed slightly, where the pen had been set down and taken up again, the way a person does when a thing takes more than one sitting, to say correctly when you have to live with what you've written for a while before you know if it's true. Garrett Edmund wrote, "I have used your name your entire life in my private thoughts, though we have never met. I know this is strange. I ask you to forgive the strangeness of it and understand that it came from love rather than presumption. Your mother was the finest person I've known. I do not say this as the sentiment of someone who idealized what he lost. I say it as the considered judgment of a man who has had 30 years to examine his memories honestly and distinguish between what was real and what grief made larger than it was. Rosalind was clear-eyed and brave, and genuinely good, which is rarer than people acknowledge. She made difficult choices with integrity, and the most difficult choice she made was to ensure that you would be protected from the consequences of my situation with Reginald Voss. She understood that if you were publicly known as my son, you would spend your childhood as a target, a resource to be exploited by someone who had already demonstrated what he was willing to do with people he considered resources. She loved you enough to give you an ordinary life in exchange for a connected one. I have spent 30 years deciding that she was right. I have watched you live that ordinary life from a distance. I want you to know that what I saw was not a diminished version of what might have been. It was a life built on real foundations. You are a craftsman who understands that things are made to last. You are a father who shows up. These are not small things. These are the things that matter when everything else is stripped away. The house is yours. Everything in the vault is yours. But I want to be clear about something because I have always believed that clarity is a form of respect. The house and the vault are not the inheritance. They are the delivery mechanism. The inheritance is the knowledge that you were always loved, that Rosalind loved you with the full capacity of a remarkable person, that I have loved you across a distance that was never my preference, but was always my choice made in service of your safety. You will have questions I cannot answer from here. I hope Mrs. Whitmore can answer some of them. She has been my connection to your world for many years, and she knows more of the story than anyone living. The ring in this box was your mother's. She gave it back to me before she died and asked me to give it someday to the woman you chose to love. She said that love like ours shouldn't end with her, it should go forward into the people who come after. I have held it for 30 years. I give it to you now to do with as she intended. Take care of the boy. I watched him from a distance, too, for the years I had left to watch, and he is a remarkable child. He has Rosalind's directness and her way of going toward what matters without waiting for someone to tell him it's allowed. He will do well. He is already doing well. I am sorry I could not be more to you in the ordinary ways. I tried to be something to you in the only way available to me. I hope it was enough. With love across a great distance, Edmund. Garrett stood in the chamber and held the letter for a long time. He was not aware of the agents around him, or the vault being documented, or the sound of Prescott Voss being escorted up the staircase. He was aware of the letter in his hands, and the ring in the box, and the particular quality of the silence in a room that has held something for 30 years and has finally released it. the silence of completion of a long promise kept. Then Cody was beside him, moving quietly through the space between the agents to stand at his father's side, close enough that their shoulders touched. Garrett put his arm around his son's shoulders. Cody read the letter without being offered it, simply leaning in and reading it from where he stood, the way he had always moved through the world toward what mattered without waiting for permission. When Cody finished, he was quiet for a moment thinking. He said, "He watched us." "He did," Garrett said, "for a long time, for as long as he could." Cody thought about this carefully, the way he thought about things that were genuinely complicated. He said, "I think that's sad and good at the same time." Garrett looked down at his son. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it is." They stayed in the chamber for another hour while Briggs's team completed the initial documentation. Then they climbed the stone staircase together back through the tower room with its painted stars and through the house that had been waiting for them, and came out into the November evening where the last light was going from the sky in bands of orange and gray, and the air smelled of cold earth and wood smoke from somewhere down the road. Mrs. Whitmore was on the porch with coffee and the patience of someone who has kept a vigil for a very long time and is finally permitted to set it down. Garrett told her about the letter. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He wrote that letter over several years, actually. He would add to it when something happened, when he found a photograph of you, when he learned about Cody, when he heard about your work. It was never finished until just before he disappeared. He kept adding things he wanted to make sure he'd said. He knew he was leaving. He knew someone was going to find the vault eventually," she said. "And he knew that if that person was the right person, they would need to hear from him directly. He wanted it to feel like a letter, not a legal document. He was very clear about that." She paused. "I think he succeeded." Garrett held the wooden box with the ring in it and thought about Rosalind writing her last letter in January 1973. The hurried handwriting, the urgency, the absolute trust placed in a man she loved and believed in. He thought about Edmund receiving that letter and understanding what it meant, and then spending the next 30 years honoring the obligation of it without a single day of rest from the responsibility. The scale of that kind of faithfulness was not something Garrett had words for, but he recognized it. He had seen it in the grain of good wood, in the way a well-made joint holds across decades of use and weather and pressure, in the particular integrity of things that were built to last rather than built to impress. Edmund Hargrove had built to last. 6 months later, Millhaven looked different to Garrett in ways that were both concrete and harder to name. The concrete part was the house itself. He had spent the winter and spring doing what he did best, working through the restoration, methodically room by room, learning the house's own logic and honoring it, replacing what needed replacing and preserving what deserved to be preserved. He had hired 4 local craftsmen whose skills matched the workmen who had been struggling for the same economic reasons that had brought Garrett to Gary and then to Millhaven, and the 5 of them had given the Hargrove house back, something it had been accumulating toward across 100 years of existence. The paint was fresh and historically accurate. The porch no longer sagged. The windows, all of them, admitted light without apology. The stained glass panels beside the front door glowed with their original depth of color in the morning sun. The bones had always been exceptional. Now the rest of it matched. Callaway Restoration had its first 3 commissions before the house was finished, word traveling in the way that good work travels in small communities, person to person, based on what people could see with their own eyes when they drove past on Hargrove Lane. Garrett took on each job with the same approach he'd applied to the Hargrove housework, that is meant to last, done by people who understand that durability is a form of respect for everyone who will come after you. Rosalind's Promise Foundation had been operating for 4 months, and in that time had processed 47 applications for emergency assistance across Indiana, with partnership agreements signed with organizations in 7 other states. Single parents, families facing medical debt, people navigating the gap between having work and having enough of it, the exact population of people who fell through the spaces in the systems built to help them. Edmund had drawn the blueprint for the foundation in his final journal entries. Garrett was simply building what had already been designed which was he had come to understand the nature of all good inheritance. Agent Briggs called on a Tuesday morning in April to report that Prescott Voss had entered a guilty plea to the federal charges: racketeering, conspiracy, financial fraud, harassment of multiple families over 2 decades. 22 years, Briggs said, with the characteristic economy of someone who delivers significant information without editorializing. The Voss family assets had been frozen pending the completion of civil proceedings, a process that would take years, but whose direction was not in doubt. Garrett sat on the porch after that call with his coffee and thought about Prescott Voss in his tailored suit on this same porch 8 months ago, saying the words, "three families," before you tried to make this work. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and more durable, the specific satisfaction of a balance restored, of a thing that had been out of alignment for 50 years, being brought back into true. A craftsman's satisfaction, which is different from victory and lasts longer. He called Mrs. Whitmore out to the porch and told her. She said Edmund would have been relieved. Not happy exactly. Relieved. There's a difference. Garrett understood the distinction completely. The harder-to-name part of how Millhaven looked different was simply this: it was home. He had lived in enough places over 53 years to know the difference between a place you are living and a place that has claimed you. And this one had claimed him, the particular quality of the morning light through the restored stained glass, the way the main street composed itself around its own persistence. The sound of Cody's feet on the staircase in the house that had been built for exactly this kind of ordinary daily noise, and had been waiting for it for 30 years. Cody had thrived in ways that Garrett watched with the particular attention of a parent who has been worried and is learning carefully to stop. His friendship with Marcus from down the road had deepened into the kind of boyhood friendship that is really an education in how to be a person full of argument and loyalty, and the specific curriculum of two kids figuring out the world by running through it together. He played on a little league team now with a glove that fit properly and did not have a cracking thumb seam, and he pitched with a focus and precision that reminded Garrett in ways he couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been paying the same close attention across the same number of years of Edmund. On an evening in late May, with the light going gold through the restored stained glass panels in the parlor and the smell of Mrs. Whitmore's cooking coming from the kitchen, Garrett stood at the base of the grand staircase and ran his hand along the newel post. The carved walnut column with the compass rose motif that he had admired since the first day and now understood completely. Edmund had put the compass rose there because it pointed in all directions at once. Not to any single destination, but to all of them, acknowledging that the way forward is not one fixed bearing, but a range of possibilities available to whoever is standing at the center with their hands open and their attention directed outward rather than inward. He took the brass key from his jacket pocket. He had carried it every day since finding it in the wall of the parlor on that October afternoon when everything had begun. It had grown warm with the warmth of his body over these months, and it sat in his palm now with the settled weight of something that has found its proper place. He heard Cody on the stairs above him, coming down at the particular speed of a child who has remembered something important and is moving toward it accordingly. Cody came around the curve of the staircase and saw his father at the bottom and slowed to a walk the way he always did when he noticed that Garrett was in a contemplative state, giving him room without withdrawing from him, which was a quality of attention that Garrett had never quite managed to teach and had simply watched develop on its own. He came to stand beside him. They stood together at the base of the staircase in the late evening light, in the house that had been built for permanence in the town that had been waiting for them without knowing it, in a life that had arrived through a door neither of them had known existed until they walked through it. Garrett held out the key. Cody took it and turned it in his hands the way he always had, examining it from every angle, looking for the angle that showed something new. The heart-shaped bow, the engraved compass roses, the interlocking circles, the symbols that had led them piece by piece to everything they now had. "Dad," Cody said, "do you think there are more things to find?" Garrett looked at his son holding the key in the warm evening light and thought about Edmund building his trail, one hidden room at a time, one letter at a time, one carefully placed symbol at a time, sustained across decades by faith in a future he would not live to see, but believed in completely. I think he said that that's exactly the right question to keep asking. Cody looked at the key for another moment, turning it once more. Then he looked up at his father with the expression Garrett had learned to love most, the one that contained both the child he was and the person he was steadily becoming, visible at the same time, in the same face, neither one obscuring the other. Then let's keep looking, Cody said. Outside, the May evening was settling over Millhaven in layers of warmth and bird song, and the smell of the season turning towards something new. The house held them the way good houses hold the people inside them, without drama, without announcement, with the simple and durable fact of walls and floors and the work of hands that understood they were building for the long run, for people they might never meet, for futures they could only imagine and choose to believe in. The key caught the last of the light as Cody turned it one final time, and for a moment the engraved symbols along its shaft, the compass roses in interlocking circles, and the heart-shaped bow that had started all of it on an October afternoon, when a boy was cleaning a wall and found something that wasn't supposed to be there, glowed with a warmth that was part metal and part something else, something that had to do with the distance. A thing can travel across time when it is made with care and left for the right hands to find, and with the particular enduring truth that love, when it is real and when it is patient, does not diminish with distance or time, but waits and holds and finds its way home.